The Amazon rainforest is home to many indigenous peoples, making up some of the world's most culturally diverse populations. In Brazil, indigenous rights are enshrined in the constitution, which guarantees their autonomy and protection of their traditional lands. Despite this, indigenous people in Brazil still face significant threats to their rights and the protection of their lands. The Amazon rainforest has been inhabited by indigenous people for centuries, and many of these communities still rely on the forest for their subsistence. Unfortunately, many of these communities have seen their traditional lands gradually shrinking due to deforestation and land grabs. This has led to the displacement of indigenous communities, as well as the destruction of their traditional way of life. In addition to the threat of deforestation, indigenous peoples in Brazil also face the threat of violence and discrimination. Indigenous people have long been the victims of violence and discrimination, especially from Brazil's police and military forces. This has been compounded by the increasing presence of illegal miners, loggers, and ranchers in the Amazon, all of whom are often armed and pose a serious threat to indigenous communities. In response to the many threats to indigenous rights, the Brazilian government has made efforts to protect indigenous land rights. In 1988, the Brazilian Constitution declared that indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional lands, as well as the right to be consulted about any development projects that may affect them. In addition, the government has set aside indigenous territories in the Amazon, which are protected from deforestation and other development. Despite these protections, indigenous rights in Brazil are still far from guaranteed. Many indigenous communities have not been consulted about projects on their land, and those that have been consulted have often been ignored. In addition, indigenous peoples are still vulnerable to violence and discrimination. The protection of indigenous rights in Brazil is essential to the future of the Amazon rainforest. Without indigenous people, the forest will be unable to sustain itself, and the biodiversity that makes it so unique will be lost. It is therefore vital that indigenous rights be respected and their traditional lands protected. Only then can the Amazon rainforest continue to be a source of life and hope for generations to come.